Darkness had settled over the land in a hush that felt impenetrable, a silence that seeped into every crevice of the night. The moon was veiled by thick clouds, and the cold cut sharper than any blade. Ever since the winds began to howl from the far north, there had been an unease creeping through Winterfell's ancient stone walls, an anticipation of something cataclysmic on the horizon. Word had come that the wall had fallen, that the army of the dead was marching south, unstoppable and ravenous. Many had fled, but many had come to stand their ground, to fight and defend the realms of men however they could. Yet under that canopy of darkness something else was stirring, something that once dwelled only in myth, something older than the oldest houses of Westeros. The courtyard of Winterfell was a hive of desperation. Torches sputtered and hissed in the frosty air, lighting the frantic preparation of men and women bearing arms, forging spears of dragon glass, sharpening swords, and fitting armor. The wind never relented, cutting through woolen cloaks as if they were nothing. No one spoke louder than a murmur, as though raising one's voice might summon the horrors rumored to lurk just beyond the flickering halo of light. Among the chaos, Daenerys Targaryen stood with shoulders tense and eyes distant. She had lost dragons to the Great War already, had watched the might of her children tested against an ancient enemy. The grief that clung to her was still raw, but she kept it to herself, channeling every pang of loss into a steady burning purpose. Her determination to save the living was unwavering, even if the cost of victory felt unimaginable. Jon Snow was with her, his newly accepted Targaryen heritage adding a complexity to their bond that neither had fully navigated. His face was haunted by the memories of everything he had seen, the white glint in the eyes of the whites as they swarmed the living, the Night King's silent fury, and the unholy shriek of Viserion, reborn in ice and death. He cast a glance at Daenerys. The torchlight flickered across her pale hair, making it seem as if she still carried the fires of dragons within her. She looked ready to burn down the world to save it if she had to, and he almost believed she could. He reached for her hand. She let him take it, though her gaze never left the unlit horizon. The subtle gesture tethered them both to some shred of hope. They had planned carefully for the battle they knew was soon to descend upon them. The ravens had flown to every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, though many never returned. Winterfell had gathered as many knights, lords, and warriors as could answer the call. The crypts swelled with the wounded and the helpless, each face etched with dread and the wish to be anywhere else. Fires were built high, forming a circle of flame around the castle to ward off the monstrous cold. But still, the rumors spread in hushed whispers that this would be the last night, the final stand against an ancient foe that did not stop, did not tire, and was untouched by fear. Yet, amid the despair, a new rumor began to sprout in the cracks of the old walls, an echo of a magic thought long gone. Deep beneath Winterfell, further even than the storied crypts, lay hidden tunnels that had not seen a living soul for countless generations. Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, had felt something stirring in those depths whenever he let his mind wander beyond the constraints of his broken body. He sensed a pulse in the cold stone, as though something beneath the castle was resonating with the friction of ice and fire that now hung over the realm. He had tried to explain it to his siblings, but they had looked at him with worry and confusion, for the ways of the Green Seer were an enigma to them still. Bran only knew that there was a spark, a restlessness, an awakening that defied the logic of any maester's dusty old tomes. Outside, the sky seemed to dim even further, as if the stars themselves had been smothered. The shriek of a distant horn shattered the night. Men tensed and gripped their weapons. Daenerys lifted her chin, expecting the faint shape of whites on the horizon. But there was nothing to see, only swirling flakes of snow shimmering in torchlight. Another horn blast echoed, forlorn and deep. Jon felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then silence again. Some claimed it was the wind, playing tricks on weary minds. Others insisted they saw something move in the blackness. Uncertainty gnawed at every heart, and adrenaline tightened every muscle. Despite the tenseness in the air, Daenerys and Jon found a moment alone, standing near the stables where the horses whinnied with anxiety. The beasts seemed to sense the unstoppable tide of death that was rolling southward. Daenerys spoke in a low voice, her breath visible in the cold. She voiced a fear she had only just begun to acknowledge, that her efforts might not be enough, that even her dragon, Drogon, might not turn the tide against the unstoppable might of the dead. With tears she wouldn't let fall, she recalled how Rhaegal had been injured, barely able to fly, and how Viserion had become a tool of the enemy. Even a dragon's fire wasn't guaranteed victory over the Night King. Jon pressed her hand against his chest, tried to assure her that if they stood united, if they faced the enemy together, there was hope. But she could see his uncertainty too. All around Winterfell, watchmen paced along the battlements, half frozen but unwavering, eyes keen for the slightest sign of movement. The uneasy hush deepened, as if the world held its breath. Below, in that labyrinth beneath the castle, Bran sat in his wheelchair, alone save for the faint crackle of a lone torch mounted on a damp wall. He had followed a beckoning sensation to these seldom visited tunnels. Every inch of stone dripped with condensation, and the air was so cold that it burned in the lungs. He took a breath, let his eyelids droop until the world around him was only a watery blur. Then he slipped into a vision. His consciousness flew, as free as a raven's flight, across a landscape of swirling snow and frigid wind. He saw the silhouette of an undead dragon perched on a crumbling section of the wall, ice crystals flaring from its nostrils. He saw the Night King's pale eyes scanning the southern lands, anticipating the feast of death he would bring upon them. Then the vision pulled him away, southward, below the crypts of Winterfell once more. Through solid rock, his phantom sight descended until it found a chamber he had never known. There, in an expanse of darkness, were bones. Huge bones. Dragon bones. When his heart should have hammered, he felt only the calm neutrality of the three-eyed raven's perspective. He observed them, realized how old they must be, how forgotten by time. And then they moved. A twitch of a talon, a stirring of hollow rib cages. A faint glow pulsed along the lines of those ancient frames. Fire and ice warred in that hidden chamber, a deep magic ignited by the presence of the others in the realm. Bran felt the bones yearn to be whole again, felt a tether he could follow, like a dull ache of memory in the weirwood net. He woke from the vision abruptly, gasping. The torch flickered, revealing no one else in the corridor. Yet something lingered in his mind, a certainty that beneath Winterfell, something impossible was happening. The old bones of Targaryen dragons, long believed lost or never known, were starting to stir at the rise of the undead in the north. They were not at rest. The significance settled on him with a weight that made the very air thick. He could not keep this to himself. In the courtyard above, Tyrion Lannister was conferring with Davos Seaworth about the best distribution of men along the battlements and how to maintain a watch on the flanks. Both men looked drawn and exhausted, but they exchanged witty barbs out of habit, finding the faintest thread of humor to cling to in the face of oblivion. That was when Bran arrived, his breath ragged in the cold, his pale eyes shining with urgency. Tyrion knelt beside him, resting a hand on the arm of the wheelchair, a fatherly concern in his mismatched gaze. Bran's voice was quiet, but resolute as iron. He told them of what he had seen beneath the crypts, of the old bones and the stirring that felt like a heartbeat. Davos, practical as ever, asked if it might be only an echo, a memory. But Bran shook his head. He insisted the power he felt was real, that it was responding to the presence of the White Walkers. The conversation ended abruptly when they heard the blast of a horn from the ramparts. There was no more time for quiet reflection. The army of the dead had arrived. A hush fell as every soldier and watcher rushed to positions. The horns called a second time, and then a third. Shapes began to emerge from the blackness, shambling masses of ice-crusted flesh with blank, hungry eyes. The front line of whites clambered over the snowy field, heedless of the spiked barricades, wearing the tattered remnants of their mortal lives. A hush heavier than death itself pressed on the living ranks. Davos barked an order for archers to ready. Torches were thrust into bronze braziers, setting arrowheads ablaze. The night air filled with the trembling tension of 1,000 bowstrings drawn taut. Then the whites charged. The archers let loose a volley, the flaming arrows arcing across the sky like angry comets. Rows of undead collapsed into fire, but others clambered over them without pause. A second volley followed, and the shrieks that rent the air were matched only by the thunderous heartbeat in the chests of the living. Brienne of Tarth led a countercharge on horseback, her blue eyes fierce with determination as she swung her sword in wide arcs, cutting down wight after wight. Yet they kept coming, unstoppable as the tide. Far above, perched on the outer walls, the watchers witnessed the endless stream of mindless corpses trudging toward Winterfell. Daenerys felt panic claw at her insides. Drogon was perched in the courtyard behind the gates, roaring in frustration at being contained. She took one last look at Jon and saw her own dread mirrored in his gaze. Mounting Drogon with a practiced grace, she rose into the sky, trusting that Rhaegal, though wounded, would follow with Jon astride him. The two living dragons soared over the battlefield, unleashing storms of fire upon the dead. Great swathes of whites burned, turning the fields below into a pyre of flickering orange and red. Still they advanced. Inside Winterfell, panic spread. The whites battered the gates with the relentless force of 1,000 bodies. The men on the walls poured boiling oil, dropped stones, hacked at rotting fingers that gripped the parapets. Yet too many arms kept coming. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Women who had never held a sword found themselves stabbing at the groaning undead as they pushed through the broken gate. Above, Daenerys circled, her heart pounding, searching for signs of the Night King. She saw only a vast sea of undead clawing at her armies below. Drogon let loose a roar that split the heavens, as if rage alone could hold back death. Amid the furious sounds of battle, Bran's words echoed in Tyrion's mind. Something was stirring beneath the crypts, something that could potentially shift the balance. He found himself risking a moment away from the defenses, hurrying across the courtyard with a half-formed plan that made no sense logically. Yet war against the dead defied logic itself, so perhaps the answer also lay in the realm of myth and prophecy. With Davos and a small contingent of guards, Tyrion made his way down into the crypts. Sansa was there, her face pale but her voice steady as she attempted to keep the frightened children and elders calm. Tyrion placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, then guided the guards deeper, past the final resting places of Stark lords long forgotten, deeper into the labyrinth of Winterfell's foundations. Every step they took seemed to lead them into an impossible cold that bit at their bones. Their torches spat and sputtered, the flames drawing back from the darkness. Eventually, they reached a wall sealed in old stone, a barrier clearly meant to keep something behind it. The stones bore no sign of mortar, yet fit together so perfectly they might have been melded by ancient hands. Davos swore under his breath. Tyrion pressed a trembling hand to the cold rock, half expecting it to burn at his touch. Something pulsed behind it, a faint and steady throb like a monstrous heartbeat. One of the guards tried to wedge a crowbar between the rocks, but the stone wouldn't yield. Another hammered at a weak point with the pommel of his sword, but only sparks flew. The group exchanged glances, fear dancing in each set of eyes. What if Bran's vision was real? What if behind this wall lay not just bones, but something alive in some terrible, unnatural way? Above them, the battle raged on. The courtyard had become a battleground of desperate last stands. The dead poured in through gaps in the walls, climbing over piles of their own fallen to reach living flesh. Arya Stark led a group of defenders near the training grounds, weaving her way through the whites with near superhuman grace. Her blades flashed in the torchlight, severing heads, piercing hearts. Gendry fought beside her, wielding a dragon-glass warhammer that gleamed with sweat and blood. Every time they took down a wave, another replaced it. The defenders were being pushed back, forced to retreat step by step until they were pressed against the main keep's doors. Daenerys circled with Drogon overhead, unleashing jets of fire that scattered the hordes. She glimpsed Rhaegal in the distance, struggling to stay aloft, wounded in the previous battle. Then she saw him go down among a swarm of whites that leapt from a section of collapsed wall to drag him earthward. Jon's agonized cry carried across the night, but Daenerys could do nothing except roar Drogon's fury into the sky. She dived, letting Drogon's flames carve a path, trying to clear enough space around Rhaegal so he could rise again. But the press of undead was too thick. Her heart thundered as the fighting below turned into carnage. Somewhere beyond the fortress, across the snowy plains, a bitter wind cut the dark, and in its wake strode the Night King, astride the undead Viserion. His cold gaze swept across Winterfell's defenses. Without a word, he commanded his legions forward, spurring them with an unrelenting will. His presence was a chill that settled over the battlefield, sapping strength, fueling despair. Within minutes, the dead redoubled their assault, climbing every rampart, tearing down every gate. Below the crypts, the small group led by Tyrion was at a standstill before the sealed chamber. Tyrion, breath ragged, stepped back and tried to think. Bran had not mentioned how to open it, only that it existed. Inspiration struck him like a jolt of lightning. He recalled the old legends that dragons were bound to house Targaryen by blood and magic, that their flame and presence were the key to forging or breaking ancient bonds. If what lay behind the wall was truly old dragon bones, perhaps a spark of dragon flame might be the key. The thought was absurd. They had no living dragon at their disposal in these depths. But Tyrion's eyes flicked to the torches. He silently prayed to whatever gods might be listening for this to work. They found old barrels of resin, stored among the crypts for sealing cracks against the winter chill. Tyrion ordered the men to coat the base of the sealed wall. The pungent smell of pitch and resin filled the close air. Davos gave him a skeptical look, but offered no argument. With a final nod, Tyrion stepped back, pressing himself into a recess in the wall. The men tossed their torches onto the resin-soaked stone. Flames leapt up, licking at the ancient barrier with a low, hungry roar. Smoke billowed, filling the confined space with choking fumes. Still, the stone remained intact, though a faint line of cracks began to appear along the mortarless edges. Encouraged, Tyrion directed them to add more resin, to feed the flames. Heat built until it was nearly unbearable, the stone glowing a dull red in places. Above, the dead pressed the advantage, forcing the living into pockets where they were cut off from retreat. Swords clashed, men and women screamed in pain or terror, and the whites trudged onward. In a tower window, a red priestess who had come from Essos chanted softly in a forgotten tongue, tears streaming down her face at the horror of what she witnessed. She prayed for the Lord of Light to intervene, for the night truly was dark and full of terrors. At the edge of the battlefield, the living dragons roared, one pinned by undead, the other frantically attempting rescue. Men turned to see the undead Viserion swoop down, unleashing a torrent of icy flame that extinguished any living soul in its path. That was when a new sound pierced the cacophony of war, rolling up from the bowels of Winterfell like thunder from the earth itself. It was a roar, ancient and deep, layered with a power that shook the foundations. Every fighting soul paused, both living and dead, to hear the echo. Daenerys felt it jolt through her chest. Jon heard it as he struggled near Rhaegal, his eyes going wide with disbelief. The whites, for their part, did not break formation or recoil in fear. They simply continued to fight without hesitation. In the crypts, Tyrion and Davos shielded their faces from the flames and stared in shock as the wall began to collapse, charred stone crumbling away to reveal a yawning darkness beyond. Torchlight revealed silhouettes of something massive stirring within. Davos swallowed hard, unsure if they had just unleashed doom or salvation. When the dust settled, they saw heaps of enormous bones scattered across the chamber. Ribs bigger than war horses, skulls that could swallow a man whole, an immense vertebral column winding across the floor. Everything glimmered faintly, as though touched by some hidden luminescence. Then they moved, rattling and scraping against the floor, the noise reverberating through the crypt like an orchestra of horror. Tyrion felt his mouth go dry. It was no ordinary undead resurrection. The bones had a soft glow, veins of silver and gold swirling through the marrow, as if ancient magic had preserved them. Jaws parted in a silent roar, empty sockets turning toward the intruders with an unearthly awareness. Then, with agonizing slowness, the skeletons began to piece themselves together. Bones floated into alignment, fusing under some unseen power. The group backed away, uncertain whether to flee or watch. Even if they ran, there was nowhere safe to go. not with the battle raging above. They stood in awe and terror, witnessing a lost piece of the realm's past reassemble before their eyes. Once the skeletal forms took shape, they were each easily as large as Drogon or Viserion had been in their prime. The cavern was full of them. 5, 6, maybe more. Ancient dragons, once revered or feared, now a horrific echo of life. At first, they did nothing but shift and clack their jaws. Tyrion half expected them to tear him and the guards apart. But instead, they shuddered, raising their skulls to the ceiling, as if smelling the distant battle. The group flinched as one of them let out a thunderous roar that rattled centuries of dust from the vault overhead. Above, Daenerys nearly lost her grip on Drogon's spine back at the magnitude of that roar. She felt something within her blood respond, a resonance unlike anything she had known. She recalled the old tales of House Targaryen, how dragons were bound to them by more than mere training. A flicker of new hope sparked in her heart. Could it be that, just as the dead had their monstrous allies, the Targaryen legacy was about to reveal a counterbalance? For a moment, Winterfell's defenders faltered, pinned by confusion. Then from the crypts, a trembling began. The ground shook, sending debris tumbling from the battlements. Fractures ran across the courtyard, and in a burst of ancient stone, a skeleton the size of a small mountain rose through the floor, wings of bone opening like a nightmarish bloom. The entire castle groaned in protest. Screams filled the air as defenders scrambled to avoid falling rubble. The skeletal dragon, glimmering with threads of magic, fixed empty eye sockets on the masses of wights. Then, with a sound like 1,000 swords scraping together, it vomited a rush of pale blue fire that incinerated dozens of undead in an instant. The flames were not the living red-orange typical of dragons, nor the frigid blue of the undead. They were a ghostly shimmer, white-hot at the core, crackling with arcs of mystical energy. Where they struck, the dead disintegrated into frozen ash, drifting away on the bitter wind. Daenerys, still circling above, witnessed this new, impossible ally. She felt Drogon twitch beneath her, uncertain whether to attack or yield to this monstrous cousin. Daenerys closed her eyes and reached deep for the bond she shared with her dragons, the same bond that might extend to any creature of old Valyrian magic. There was a sense of something ancient responding, a presence that recognized a Targaryen's claim. She willed the skeletal dragons to join her in the fight, to burn the undead from the battlements, to challenge the Night King's supremacy. Below, Tyrion and Davos had climbed out of the crypts, battered by falling stones but otherwise unhurt. They emerged to a scene of utter chaos, wights climbing walls, living soldiers pinned in every corner. Yet now, among them strode the reanimated skeletons of dragons, each unleashing that eerie white fire that consumed entire swathes of undead in seconds. The battle began to shift. Where once the living were overwhelmed, they now had some breathing room. The new dragons soared into the night sky, half-spectral wings spreading wide as they spewed that lethal flame. Every hiss of its heat was accompanied by the final screams of hundreds of wights. Soldiers and knights rallied, seizing the opportunity to drive the dead back from the gates, from the keep's thresholds, and from the battered remnants of the outer walls. Still, amidst the mounting hope, an ominous threat remained. The Night King urged his own undead dragon forward, flanked by the White Walkers on their ice-crusted horses. Where their weapons fell, living flesh froze and shattered. Those fighting near them were snuffed out like candles in a gale. Snow whipped around them in a furious storm, obscuring the ramparts. The Night King fixated on the largest of the skeletal dragons, as though recognizing a power that might rival his own. With a silent command, Viserion swooped down, unleashing a cascade of icy flame on its bony rival. The skeletal dragon roared in defiance, meeting the barrage with its own supernatural fire. The collision of the two breaths made the air explode with swirling storms of magic and frost. The courtyard was battered by shockwaves of swirling embers and shards of ice. Daenerys and Drogon reeled in midair, nearly knocked from the sky by the force. Men and women across Winterfell took cover wherever they could. Wooden structures caught fire, stone walls cracked from the impact. Yet the dead kept fighting, driven by the silent will of their king. Jon, grounded beside the wounded Rhaegal, shielded his eyes from the blinding blasts of power overhead. Hope warred with dread within him. The skeletal dragons had given them a fighting chance, but the Night King's power was formidable beyond measure. The duel in the sky would not be enough to end the invasion. Only a direct blow against the Night King himself could do that. Daenerys circled higher, scanning the tumult below for the regal, icy figure astride Viserion. A swirl of snow parted, and she saw him there. His features were inscrutable, but she felt the weight of his malice. She urged Drogon forward, intending to roast him once and for all. Another skeletal dragon soared by her side, its empty sockets locked on the same target. Daenerys sensed that it recognized her as a Targaryen, that it understood her desire to vanquish the great Over's champion. Together, Drogon and this undead ally dove toward the Night King. Before they could close the distance, the Night King raised a hand. A shockwave of cold tore through the air, swirling into a mighty gale that nearly froze Daenerys to her saddle. Drogon's wings struggled, nearly locked in place by a sudden frost that coated his scales. The skeletal dragon hissed, white fire flickering along its jaw. But that same icy gale had begun to coat its bones in a creeping layer of blue rime. The Night King sneered, unleashing another wave of cold. Below, the living army fought desperately to keep the whites from overrunning the courtyard again. Every time the dead fell in droves to the spectral dragon's flames, the White Walkers in the distance raised more from the fallen living. Slain soldiers lurched to their feet, newly minted whites with lifeless eyes and vacant screams. The lines of living defenders sagged under the horror of it. Tyrion found himself fighting side by side with Podrick Payne, their small swords lodging in the frozen flesh of an undead foe. His mind whirled, searching for any advantage, any cunning plan. Yet in this battle, cunning alone seemed powerless against the tide of death. It was pure, unrelenting will to survive that kept the living from collapsing under the weight of despair. Then another roar filled the night, but this one different, deeper, carrying a fury that had the ring of true life. Rhaegal had regained his footing, rising behind Jon, his eyes burning with a renewed ferocity. Though wounded, the green dragon let out a roar that echoed across the castle walls. Jon turned, seeing his chance. If he could ride Rhaegal to the Night King, perhaps he could do what he had failed to do before. Perhaps, with the skeletal dragons distracting their foe, Jon could strike the final blow. His breath turned to mist in the savage cold, but he pressed on, climbing onto Rhaegal's side as the dragon spread his wings. With a few heavy beats they rose above the carnage, forging a path toward the swirling maelstrom, where Daenerys and Drogon struggled against the Night King. Even as Rhaegal ascended, whites hurled themselves from the ramparts, scrabbling at his wings. Jon slashed at them with Longclaw, severing grasping hands and decaying limbs. Rhaegal roared, a gust of flame consuming the undead that clung to him. The air crackled with tension as they cleared the courtyard and soared into the frozen darkness. Below them, the living and the dead clashed in an endless howling dance of survival. High above, Daenerys fought to keep Drogon in flight. The relentless wave of cold radiating from the Night King threatened to sap his strength. The undead Targaryen dragon, once a skeleton of cold magic, was grounded under the frost, pinned by unnatural ice. Only its eyes glowed in defiance, flickers of white fire dying on its sealed jaw. The Night King advanced, Viserion's jaws quivering with the gathering might of deathly flame. Daenerys watched, helpless. Before she could command Drogon to break free and flee, a savage roar shattered the swirling gloom. Rhaegal, battered but unbroken, barreled into Viserion's flank. The collision knocked the undead beast off course. Icy flames spewed wide, missing Drogon by mere feet. Jon clung to Rhaegal's spine back with every ounce of his strength. The impact with Viserion tore the two dragons into a tangled mass of claws and teeth. He saw the Night King tumble from Viserion's back, but a swirl of frost concealed his descent. Daenerys, seizing the opportunity, urged Drogon to the ground, searching for where the Night King might land. She saw him drop into the courtyard, silent as a phantom, scattering defenders who fled or fell in his presence. Daenerys clenched her fists around Drogon's reins, guiding the living dragon into a steep dive. The courtyard below was pure pandemonium. Soldiers fought whites in knots of desperate violence. Spectral dragons unleashed their white-hot flames on clusters of the undead, only to be stifled by White Walkers who hurled spears of ice at them. Into this chaos, the Night King landed, brushing dust and snow from his ornate armor. His dead eyes found living targets with a predator's focus. Daenerys saw him raise a hand to bring a new wave of corpses to life. She cried out, commanding Drogon to bathe him in dragonfire. Drogon roared, unleashing a torrent of flame upon the courtyard. But the Night King stood amidst the inferno, untouched as before. It was an echo of that moment beyond the wall, when Daenerys had first unleashed Drogon's fire upon him. She watched in horror as the blaze parted around him, like a river around a rock. She could almost see the cold smirk on his face. Then, from the swirling mass of whites, Bran Stark appeared, pushed in his wheelchair by a frantic Podrick Payne who had rescued him from the collapsing corridors. Bran's eyes glowed with the same eerie brilliance they always did when he was warging or searching the weirwood net. Daenerys could feel that something else moved through him, some presence older than Winterfell itself. She realized that Bran was the living repository of all past and future, the memory and spirit of man, the last bulwark against oblivion. He fixed his gaze on the Night King. In that instant, a ripple seemed to pass through the courtyard. The skeletal dragons paused in their carnage, raising their heads as though listening to a silent call. One of them turned with surprising grace, ignoring the whites gnawing at its ankle bones, and focused on the Night King. Daenerys saw a flicker in the Night King's eyes. For the first time, she recognized something akin to uncertainty. He raised an arm to defend or to strike. She couldn't tell. The skeletal dragon exhaled, releasing that ghostly white flame. The Night King's ice shield sprang up, repelling most of the fire, but cracks formed in the crystalline barrier. As the barrier shattered into shards, Podrick pushed Bran forward, straight toward the Night King, ignoring the frantic shouts of others. Bran's gaze never wavered, as though he saw not the fearsome figure that had haunted so many nightmares, but something else entirely, an ancient foe that needed to be returned to the darkness. In that heartbeat of distraction, Daenerys spotted Jon approaching the courtyard on foot, long claw clenched in both hands, eyes fixed on the Night King's pale back. Yet it was not time for that final confrontation, not yet. The Night King turned, as though sensing Jon's presence, and out of the darkness soared Viserion, battered but still under the Night King's thrall. The undead dragon's jaws opened in a furious shriek, raking the courtyard with frozen fire. Daenerys had no choice but to order Drogon to climb back into the air, lest they be consumed. Bran and Podrick withdrew under the protection of the battered lines of soldiers, the moment lost. Jon was forced to dive behind a toppled statue, cursing under his breath as the lethal ice swept overhead. The battle wore on, minutes stretching into an endless night, each breath drawn in the stench of blood and ash. The defenders of Winterfell were bolstered by the unexpected arrival of the skeletal Targaryen dragons, but the White Walkers had their own unholy might. The living were slowly losing ground again. The night felt eternal. Fear and exhaustion ate at the corners of every heart. With each second, the long night seemed poised to devour them whole. Yet, in the swirling clouds above, living dragons and skeletal dragons circled, a testament to the impossible. Proof that the old magic was still alive, even in death, and that for every terror rising from the grave, there was a spark of defiance in the blood of House Targaryen. Though no immediate victory was in sight, the tide had changed. The undead had met their match in these newly risen beasts. For each wave of whites that broke upon Winterfell, a blast of that eerie white flame or the living dragon's red fire met them. Soldiers fought on with renewed vigor, hearts buoyed by this sliver of hope. The Night King had not yet fallen, but he had been drawn into a swirling game of war on multiple fronts. The ancient Targaryen skeletons, guided by Bran's mysterious powers and Daenerys' Targaryen blood, refused to yield to the cold might of the others. Snow fell in thick torrents, the wind howled, and the living clung to their weapons in numb fingers. Nevertheless, They fought, refusing to let the night claim them without a struggle that would be remembered for ages. If any survived to remember it. The dance of ice and fire spilled across ramparts and courtyards, towers and crypts. Daenerys circled overhead, scanning for the Night King, longing to deliver a final decisive blow. But she could not ignore her new allies below, who breathed that ghostly flame onto masses of whites again and again. Her heart twisted with a blend of awe and sorrow at the sight of dragons reanimated in bone and magic. Tyrion, stumbling across debris, saw her pass overhead and thought he'd never expected to witness something so wondrous and terrible in his lifetime. Davos, his white beard flecked with blood and sweat, gave orders to the men to regroup around the keep, to hold the line against the White Walkers who advanced with supernatural calm. Jon eventually reached Daenerys' side on foot, the two of them pressing together under Drogon's wing for a moment's reprieve. Their eyes locked. He saw the fire in her gaze, the unwavering resolve. She saw the same in him, tempered by heartbreak. He had lost friends, sworn brothers, and possibly more, but he still stood. They shared a breath, a moment of connection that felt more precious than gold amid the chaos. Then, without words, they parted to continue the fight. Perhaps hours or only minutes remained until the final confrontation, but they could sense that the true battle had only just begun. The long night stretched on, starless and dark, a living canvas of fear and bloodshed. But it was not as dark as it might have been, not with the blazing conflagrations of dragonglass torches, the roars of living dragons, and the pale, shimmering flames of the newly awakened Targaryen bones. At the heart of it all, the Night King prowled, waiting for his moment to deliver the killing blow. While Bran Stark watched and willed the remnants of ancient magic to endure. For now, the clash between old powers and new raged on, the fate of Westeros hanging in the balance, suspended in the cold, unrelenting hands of night. And somewhere in that swirling maelstrom of ice and fire, hope still flickered, faint but unquenchable, like the first whisper of dawn yet to come. Diahon. Winterfell reverberated with a chorus of steel and claws and monstrous roars. Frigid wind howled through every broken battlement, sweeping across the snow-laden ground in restless surges. The living fought with a grim determination, their battered bodies pushed beyond exhaustion, arms trembling from the relentless weight of swords and axes. Horses screamed amid the din, and the stench of blood clung to the air as though it would remain even if dawn ever dared to break this long night. Somewhere in the swirling darkness, the Night King glided effortlessly through the ruin, every footstep a silent proclamation of doom. Daenerys Targaryen hovered atop Drogon, circling higher as she tried to pick out the pale figure below. The swirling snow made it nearly impossible to see anything beyond a few dozen yards. Her eyes stung from cold and tears, and her heartbeat pounded so loudly she wondered if the dragon beneath her felt it too. Drogon's great wings thrashed the air, sending gusts of icy wind spiraling out in all directions. Her mind replayed the shock of seeing her dragonfire roll off the Night King like water. The memory as jarring and painful as the moment beyond the wall when she had lost Viserion. Now there was another monstrous power afoot. Those reanimated dragon skeletons, their ghostly flame incinerating whites with terrifying efficiency. It was too great a shift to comprehend in an instant. Daenerys could only trust in the bond of blood and magic that had awakened them, believe that they fought on behalf of life rather than the endless ranks of the dead. Below, the enormous form of a skeletal dragon crouched near the collapsed walls. Mounds of shattered masonry surrounded it, twisted beams that had once been rafters or catwalks scattered like toothpicks. Whites scuttled around the beast's ankles, trying to find a grip on the slick bones and climb toward its vulnerable spine. The undead dragon exhaled again, releasing a torrent of shimmering white fire that lit the entire courtyard in a fleeting, blinding glow. Dozens of corpses collapsed into ash, and for a heartbeat, Daenerys thought she saw the newly formed ashes swirl in a shape that resembled embers lifted by the wind. Then the flame flickered away, leaving a swath of glimmering frost in its wake. Snow boiled, instantly turning to steam. The skeletal dragon let loose a metallic screech, as though mocking the futility of the dead that tried to overwhelm it. In the distance, another bony behemoth spread wings wide enough to shadow half the courtyard, stamping over the broken remains of siege engines. Like its brethren, it moved with the unsettling grace of something both ancient and unnatural. Men in battered plate reeled away from it, uncertain whether to trust such a monster. Yet whenever a horde of wights charged, the skeletal dragon annihilated them with a single sweep of its tail or a blast of that otherworldly flame. Some of the defenders rallied around it, forming a makeshift front line. Swords, pikes, and dragonglass spears hammered down upon the staggering wights in a desperate attempt to keep them away from the keep's entrances. Near the edge of the courtyard, Jon Snow steadied himself as Rhaegal landed, trembling from a fresh wound that oozed dark blood across his flank. The dragon's breathing was labored, nostrils flaring as clouds of vapor rose from his maw. Jon murmured a quiet reassurance, pressing a shaking hand to Rhaegal's scaled neck. "Just a little longer," he whispered, though his voice was nearly lost in the roar of wind and screams. Rhaegal let out a low rumble in response, neither approval nor refusal, but a tired acceptance of their shared burden. At Jon's side, Grey Worm had regrouped with a cluster of Unsullied, all bristling with spears of dragonglass. Their phalanx stood firm, a dark wedge of unwavering resolve in a scene of chaos. Blood streaked their once immaculate armor, and their expressions revealed nothing but an unbreakable will to serve the queen they had pledged themselves to. Jon acknowledged Grey Worm with a curt nod. They both knew that this was no time for words, only action. A fresh wave of wights poured in through a battered breach in the wall, howling and clawing at the air. The Unsullied advanced methodically, spears thrusting forward in perfect unison. Sickening crunches followed as the wights toppled, but more came behind them, endless as nightmares. Jon felt the weight of the Valyrian steel sword in his hand, its leather grip slick beneath his fingers, its edge etched with the legacy of his house. He forced himself to push forward, meeting the front line of the undead, cleaving through rotting limbs and bone. Each strike felt like lifting a millstone, for he was drained to the brink of collapse. Still, the memory of the Night King's eyes pushed him on, that crystalline stare that saw only oblivion. Far above, the undead Viserion battled one of the skeletal dragons in a macabre aerial duel. The two dragons collided, clawing at each other with savage fury. Bones cracked and scraps of frozen flesh tore free. Viserion's once beautiful scales were now a map of decay, and each time he opened his mouth, a column of frigid blue flame erupted. The skeletal dragon retaliated with its pale white inferno, the two arcs colliding in midair to produce explosions of sparks and swirling frost. Gargantuan shapes spiraled around the battered towers of Winterfell, each seeking advantage in the storm-lashed sky. Occasionally, one soared low over the courtyard, prompting defenders and attackers alike to scatter or be crushed. Within the keep, corridors were choked with splinters and bodies. The clang of steel echoed through the halls, a thunder that never ceased. Sansa Stark directed the flow of women, children, and the elderly from one safe room to another as structural collapses threatened the crypts. By now, parts of the lower tunnels had caved in, burying the brave men and women who had attempted to hold the line there. The gloom in her eyes spoke of desperation, but her bearing remained regal, her voice carrying an unyielding command that gave direction where chaos threatened to reign. "Move," she urged a frightened group of villagers pushing them along. Don't look back. Keep going. Her heart clenched as she wondered how many times she could utter those words before the dead closed in from all sides. Arya Stark slipped through the shadows of those same halls with a cat-like grace, her slender blade dancing in her hands. The Braavosi training coursed through her veins, making her movements faster than most could follow. She ducked under the swing of a dead man's sword, spun on her heel, and sank her dagger into the back of his skull, severing any unholy thread that animated him. When another wight lunged, she drew a dragonglass-tipped spear from a hidden sheath along her back and rammed it upward through its chin. Dark, congealed blood spattered the stones. Panting, Arya scanned the hallway. Death was her art and her old companion. But never had she faced anything like this. A foe so numerous and so unrelenting, it felt like drowning in darkness. Yet the swirl of battle was almost exhilarating. A dreadful dance that threatened to consume everything in its path. She pressed on, guided by the faint roar of dragons overhead. Tyrion Lannister, battered and stained with soot, limped through a side passage beneath a crumbling archway. His eyes were wide, grappling to process what he had helped unleash below the crypts. He had seen the old bones reassemble themselves and march forth like an army of revenants. And yet, they had not turned against the living. Quite the opposite, they were locked in mortal combat with the undead hordes. Tyrion still could scarcely believe it. Magic, he thought wryly, was never simple. With Davos Seaworth and Podrick Payne at his side, he made his way toward the Godswood, hoping to find Bran Stark. The boy, and whatever power he contained, seemed to be the linchpin of this improbable alliance. And if there was any plan at all to end the Night King, Tyrion suspected Bran might know it. They reached the Godswood to find broken branches and trampled snow. The ancient weirwood stood tall at the center, its pale bark and crimson leaves oddly vibrant against the backdrop of devastation. Figures moved among the trees, a band of wights that must have broken through the perimeter. Some still wore the tarnished plate of knights, others ragged leathers. Their mouths gaped soundlessly, an unvoiced hunger in their eyes. Tyrion glanced at Davos and the older man nodded, setting his jaw. They had come too far to turn back now. Together, with Podrick at their side, they readied weapons. Tyrion's heart hammered. They were only three, hardly a match for even a handful of the dead. But perhaps the gods favored fools this night. Before the wights could fully converge, a flicker of movement drew their attention. Another silhouette emerged from behind the weirwood. Bran sat in his wheeled chair, cloaked in shadows, eyes distant and strange. The wights turned toward him, arms reaching out as if entranced. Tyrion gasped, cursing under his breath, and prepared to charge forward, ready to buy the boy what little time he could. But then Bran's eyes rolled upward, and a pulse of energy rippled through the Godswood, as tangible as a gust of wind. The branches of the weirwood trembled, the red leaves rustling. The wights jerked violently, as if invisible strings had pulled them all at once. Several collapsed on the spot, their bones turning limp in the snow. One remained standing, a tall figure with half its skull missing. It staggered forward, driven by the Night King's will, or perhaps some deeper malice. Tyrion tried to rush it, sword in hand, but the wight swung a broken blade and knocked him back. Davos lunged to intercept. His dragging glass-tipped spear punched through the wight's chest, sending a spiderweb of frost cracking through its torso. The creature twitched once more, then sank to its knees and dissolved into a heap of discolored remains. The Godswood fell silent, the rustling leaves the only sound. Tyrion coughed, struggling back to his feet. "Bran?" he rasped, breath steaming in the cold air. "Is there a plan to finish this? To end the Night King for good?" He looked around, expecting more wights, but none emerged from the tree line. The swirl of white flakes above them made everything hazy, dreamlike. Bran's eyes refocused slowly, as though returning from some great distance. "The long night is a cycle," he said, voice soft, carrying an echo of countless memories he alone held. "It comes when the balance is broken. Every tale of old, every prophecy, leads to this dance of ice and fire, waiting for a champion to break it." He blinked, and for a moment, Tyrion wondered if he was truly speaking to Bran, or someone else wearing the boy's face. The Night King is bound by a power older than men. Death made flesh by a cruel turning of the weirwood's gifts. To kill him, we must wield that which first created him, something deeper than dragonglass or Valyrian steel. Davos' brow furrowed with worry. Then how do we find it? Do we have it already? Nadam Dobiner. Bran's eyes flickered, almost as if he were listening to a voice only he could hear. "Not yet," he murmured. "It rests at the heart of an ancient place, lost to living memory. We might not have time to seek it." He paused, hands tightening on the wooden arms of his chair. "There is another way, but it will require all the power we can muster. The power of life against the darkest winter." Tyrion swallowed, imagining the unstoppable tide of wights and white walkers beyond the Godswood. "We don't have the luxury of days or even hours," he said. "They're at our gates, They might overrun us before dawn. What can we do now? Bran's gaze shifted toward the sky, where the skeletal dragons and living dragons still battled the undead Viserion. The key lies in dragonfire, but not in the way we've attempted before. The bond that awakened those bones in the crypts can be harnessed. He drew in a breath, and his face looked older than the oldest kings in the north. Daenerys stands with them, those old Targaryen dragons, and offers a united flame. The resulting conflagration might break the Night King's defenses, long enough for Jon to strike, or for Arya, or for anyone who has the courage to drive a blade of Valyrian steel through his heart. Dender. Tyrion felt a spark of hope, tempered by the knowledge of how difficult that would be. Daenerys had already unleashed Drogon's fire on the Night King once, and it had done nothing. Yet now, they had these reanimated dragons, thrumming with an ancient magic perhaps as old as the children of the forest themselves. If the synergy of their flames could pierce the Night King's immunity, then perhaps the tide would turn. Tyrion nodded, glancing at Davos and Podrick. He could see in their eyes that no matter the odds, they would seize any chance to save the living. "We'll tell her," he said, voice quavering with urgency. "Stay safe, Bran." Without another word, he pivoted and led the others back toward the courtyard, praying the lines had not fully collapsed in their absence. The courtyard was a charnel house, but still held by a thinning pocket of living defenders. Broken spears and shattered shields littered the ground. Burning piles of white smoldered, the stench of cooked flesh nearly unbearable. Somewhere along the ramparts, Brienne of Tarth led a band of knights in a desperate push, driving whites off the battlements. Jaime Lannister was with her, sword flashing under the dim light, his remaining hand steady as he slashed and parried. Their breath fumed in the cold, and ice crusted on their cloaks. When they managed to knock the last undead from the parapet, they saw Tyrion rushing below, shouting at the top of his lungs for Daenerys. Jaime's eyes widened with recognition, then flicked to Brienne in silent question. She nodded. They would keep the ramparts secure to avoid being flanked again. Every corner of Winterfell demanded its own champion. Daenerys, having landed Drogon near a collapsed tower, was helping a wounded soldier onto the dragon's back. A swirl of snow coated her silver-white hair, and her cheeks were flushed with cold. Tyrion nearly stumbled into her, mind spinning from the swirl of chaos and the knowledge Bran had imparted. "Your Grace," he panted. "Bran says, there's a way, but we need your flame and the flame of those skeletal dragons together, all directed at the Night King." Daenerys' brows drew together. "Bran?" she asked, voice sharpened by stress. "Are we truly meant to trust the word of a boy lost in visions? We tried dragonfire once. It didn't work." Tyrion swallowed, forcing composure. "Bran's more than a boy now. You know that. The Night King is older than we can fathom, and this is ancient magic against ancient magic. If we can harness the combined might of every dragon, living or dead, it might create an opening for someone to strike, even if it's only for a moment." Daenerys pressed her lips into a thin line. Half a year ago she would have dismissed such a suggestion outright. But the events of the last weeks, indeed, the last hours, had proven that the boundaries of possibility no longer held any meaning. She glanced skyward, where one of the skeletal dragons dived on a mass of whites near the gates. "Then we shall try," she said firmly. "Tyrion, find Jon Tuttle. Tell him to ready himself. I'll bring Drogon and do what I must. But how do I command those skeletons? They don't heed my words the way my children do." "Now," Tyrion grimaced, "I'm not entirely certain. Bran believes they'll respond to your Targaryen blood, as well as his influence. Perhaps if you fly close to them, they'll know your intent." A fresh wave of whites tore through a splintered door to their left, prompting an outcry from a cluster of defenders. Daenerys gave Tyrion a curt nod, then spurred Drogon into motion, leaving him to handle the crisis before she soared into the bitter night. As Drogon lifted off, each powerful beat of his wings scattered snow across the broken courtyard. Daenerys peered down, searching for the skeletal behemoths. She spotted one near the remnants of the stables, pinned beneath a partial collapse of stone and ice. The undead creature thrashed, its hollow eye sockets flaring with an eerie luminescence. Dozens of wights crawled over it like ants on a carcass, hacking at its ribcage in some mindless attempt to disable it. Fury surged through Daenerys. These new allies were the only thing giving them a chance, and she would not see them taken down. Drogon landed with earth-shaking force, scattering the wights in a hail of broken limbs. Daenerys leapt from the saddle, brandishing a short Valyrian steel sword, a relic she had taken from the spoils of war in King's Landing. In a single sweeping motion, she slashed at the wights that continued to swarm, white-hot adrenaline fueling her. Drogon bellowed, spewing a roar of blazing fire that immolated the rest. Bits of charred flesh and bone clattered to the ground. The skeletal dragon, freed from the worst of the entrapment, hauled itself upright. Fractured pieces of its vertebra fused back together as it moved, as though the magic animating it was trying to repair the damage. Steam rose around it in wisps, and it lowered its great skull to regard Daenerys for a tense second. She felt the weight of that gaze despite the emptiness of its eye sockets, an unsettling sensation that coursed through her veins like electricity. Carefully, she extended a hand, palm open. Drogon hissed protectively behind her, uncertain but trusting his mother's intent. The skeletal dragon sniffed the air, then released a hollow-sounding exhalation. A wave of heat and cold intermixed, ruffling Daenerys' cloak. She clenched her teeth as the temperature crashed around her, but she did not recoil. Something stirred within her blood, that inexpressible bond she had known only with her children. Here it was again, primal and powerful, but also alien. It recognized her lineage, the blood of the dragon, and it begrudgingly bent to that authority. The undead creature let out a ghastly, scraping call that resonated through the courtyard, seemingly announcing to its kin that the Dragon Queen was among them. Far above, the other skeletal dragons rumbled in response, an echoing chorus that set the night quaking with possibility. Daenerys mounted Drogon once more, beckoning the undead dragon to follow. It stretched its wings, tattered membranes that shimmered with ephemeral magic, and with a whoosh, it took flight. One by one, the other skeletal dragons turned from their personal battles, their empty eyes lifted to the sky. They too soared up, swirling into formation with the living black shape of Drogon and the wounded but still living green of Rhaegal, who struggled to keep aloft. It was a monstrous aerial procession, a ring of fiery life and death above Winterfell, held together by a precarious synergy of primal forces. Below, the wights continued their ceaseless onslaught. Pockets of defenders retreated further into the keep, forced to make their stands in cramped hallways and behind makeshift barricades. But when they saw the shadow of those dragons circle overhead, many let out rallying cries, hope shining in their eyes. The dead might be strong, but so was the living's ancient birthright. Across the broken yards, men and women found new courage, even in the face of battered limbs and frozen fingers. Jon and Ghost navigated the war-torn passage near the main gate, searching for any sign of the Night King. The direwolf growled low in his throat, ears pricked. Blood matted Ghost's white fur, but he showed no sign of stopping. Jon could only be grateful the direwolf had survived this long. He saw a figure in the swirling snow, tall and impossibly still. His heart lurched. The figure wore the armor of the others, its flesh pale and eyes glowing. Not the Night King, but another White Walker. It lifted a sword of shimmering ice and strode toward Jon in eerie silence, only the hiss of the wind accompanying its steps. Jon lifted Longclaw, forcing the trembling from his arms. For a moment he recalled that first time he had truly faced a White Walker, the horror of watching steel shatter and men die. But now he had Valyrian steel, and he had fought them before. No matter the cost, he would not yield. With a savage shout, he charged. The White Walker swung its blade, a blow that could have snapped a lesser weapon like a twig. Jon met it, sparks bursting in a swirl of ice crystals as Valyrian steel clashed with cursed ice. He slipped on the snowy ground but recovered, pivoting to slash at the Walker's flank. The creature danced away, expression unreadable, eyes flaring with malevolent light. Ghost snarled and lunged, clamping jaws around the Walker's arm. The walker hissed a soundless fury, yanking the direwolf off balance. Jon sized the opening, driving Longclaw forward. The moment the blade touched the walker's flesh, a crackling spread across its translucent skin, like molten lines creeping through ice. The walker let out a silent scream, weapon dropping from its hand. Jon heaved with all his strength, and the blade broke through the walker's chest. In an instant, the ancient creature shattered into glimmering shards, collapsing into a pile of frozen fragments that hissed away into steam. Ghost tumbled onto the snow, panting, his flanks heaving. Jon knelt, pressing a hand to the direwolf's side, grateful beyond words for his loyal companion. Then he rose, scanning the gloom. The White Walker was destroyed, but the Night King was still out there, and time was slipping like sand through an hourglass. High above, Daenerys led her impossible flight of dragons, spiraling through the stormy sky in search of their ultimate foe. At first, she spotted only waves of white surging across the land. Flickers of spectral flame peppered the battlefield where the skeletal dragons targeted the largest concentrations of undead. Then, at the outer edge of Winterfell's walls, she saw him. The Night King stood like a monolith of ice. His arms rose in a gesture both regal and cruel, and Daenerys' heart hammered at what she knew was coming. The dead that had recently fallen stirred once more, unholy vitality flaring in their emptied bodies. Fallen knights, archers, small folk, all rose to their feet with rigid motions. Their eyes, once frantic in life, glazed with deathly calm. She watched her own men, some whose faces she recognized, stand and turn to confront their former allies. Her stomach churned with revulsion and sorrow. A distant roar snapped her attention skyward. Viserion dove out of the swirling snow, bearing the ragged banner of undead fury. Ice shards dripped from his maw, and an ever-present swirl of eerie blue flame curled around his throat. He saw the flight of living and skeletal dragons, recognized their challenge, and charged with a shriek that set the air shivering. Daenerys locked her gaze on the hideous parody of her once beloved child. Fury and grief filled her eyes with tears that froze on her cheeks. "Dragon," she whispered, not needing more words. Her dragon answered with a thunderous bellow, leading the charge as they closed in on Viserion. On either flank, two skeletal dragons mirrored Drogon's movements, trailing streams of ghostly flame in their wake. Viserion unleashed an arc of biting cold, a beam of dead blue energy that crackled across the night sky. One skeletal dragon took the brunt of it, screaming in a metallic wail as portions of its bones froze solid. The impact sent it spiraling downward, crashing into the ramparts in an eruption of rock and swirling snow. It lay still, half its ribcage shattered. Daenerys grit her teeth and steeled her heart. The other dragons swerved around the torrent of frost, returning fire with a searing combination of living dragon flame and spectral blasts. Viserion roared in rage as the conflagration collided with his ice. Steam roiled across the battlefield, obscuring vision for a crucial few seconds. Emerging from the banks of steam, Viserion managed to clamp his jaws around the wing of another skeletal dragon, ripping away entire sections of bone. The reanimated creature shrieked, retaliating with a claw that raked across Viserion's tattered scales, dislodging chunks of decaying flesh. Underneath, pale ribs gleamed with an unearthly shimmer, as if the Night King's magic had replaced the dragon's once living organs. The two twisted together, a writhing knot of thrashing limbs, until Drogon lunged, burying his fangs into Viserion's neck. Bones snapped, and Viserion jolted with a tremor of agony or rage. Daenerys couldn't be sure which. She only felt the savage adrenaline coursing through Drogon's fury as he tried to tear out his undead sibling's throat. But the Night King was not idle. From below, he saw the swirl of battle overhead and raised a spear of ice, shaped from the frozen air around him. The slick weapon glinted with dark magic, swirling with a bluish aura. Without hesitation, he hurled it skyward. A streak of frost parted the night, heading straight for Drogon's unguarded flank. Daenerys' eyes widened. She remembered too well how such a spear had ended Viserion's life once before. She urged Drogon away, but the timing was impossibly tight. The spear grazed Drogon's haunch with a sickening crack, sending shards of black scales and sizzling blood into the night. Drogon screeched in pain, nearly spiraling out of control. Only Daenerys' iron will and the dragon's own fierce spirit kept them aloft. Below, the ground quaked with the approach of galloping hooves. Jon had commandeered a half-lame horse abandoned by a fallen knight, forcing it into a ragged canter through the chaos. His gaze was fixed on the Night King, that implacable figure commanding the dead at will. If Tyrion's message was true, Daenerys would attempt some unorthodox assault with the skeletons, giving Jon the moment he needed to strike. He kept Longclaw drawn, and on his belt hung a dagger of dragonglass. Ghost ran at his side despite the pain from his wounds, the direwolf's breath ragged. They crested a low mound of rubble, where part of the wall had collapsed, granting a clearer view of the courtyard. The Night King sensed Jon's presence. Slowly, he turned those pale eyes toward him, unmoved by the swirl of gore or the monstrous aerial battle overhead. With a tilt of his head, he directed a knot of wights to rush Jon's position. They came in a ragged line, their forms half-frozen, clawed hands outstretched. Jon spurred the horse onward, knowing any hesitation would spell doom. He bowled into the wights, lashing out with Longclaw, severing heads and cleaving torsos. But the horse screamed, bucking as skeletal arms latched onto it. Jon was thrown free, tumbling hard onto the icy ground. Stars danced in his vision, and he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. Desperation overcame him. He rolled to avoid the groping hands of the wights. One lunged, a woman with half her face rotted away, jaws snapping. Jon thrust Longclaw up, piercing the underside of her jaw. She collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. He scrambled upright, searching frantically for the Night King. That unearthly figure stood a few dozen yards away, silent as a tomb, conjuring another spear of ice. Jon's blood ran cold. The ephemeral glimmer around the spear's tip suggested it crackled with even more potent magic. But before the Night King could throw it, an ear-splitting roar came from above. Daenerys and Drogon descended in a tight spiral, accompanied by 3 skeletal dragons, their heads angled toward a single point, all jaws open in unison. In a moment of primal unity, each creature unleashed its flame, forming a swirling column of fire that glowed red, gold, and white-hot. Daenerys felt the energy surge through her, burning her lungs, stinging her eyes. It was unlike any dragonfire she had felt before, magnified by a synergy older than House Targaryen itself. The Night King lifted his spear in defense, generating a shield of shimmering ice around him, an aura as cold as the void. Fire collided with ice in a collision that made the earth groan. And for an instant it seemed the very air tore open in a violent shriek of steam and fury. Jon shielded his face, staggering under the raw force. A shockwave rolled across the courtyard, toppling wights, cracking stone, and knocking men from their feet. Droplets of superheated water rained down, sizzling and freezing again, almost instantly. Beneath that unstoppable conflagration, the Night King's ice shield faltered. Cracks blossomed across its surface, like lightning frozen in glass. The unnatural barrier flickered, and for the first time, the Night King appeared to strain. The edges of his form wreathed in swirling flames that threatened to devour him. Daenerys poured her will into Drogon's breath, while the skeletal dragons added their own spectral roars. The combined fire drilled down, focusing on the Night King. The spear in his hand began to splinter, dripping away in streams of melted icicles. Jon saw his moment. The Night King was trapped, even if only for a few heartbeats, unable to move or turn away from the torrent that assailed him. Jon sprinted across the courtyard, boots sliding on the bloody ice. The heat from the flames scalded his skin, but he pushed through, circling behind the Night King's left side, searching for an opening. He remembered what Bran had said. The synergy of these ancient flames might buy the living a single chance to strike. Adrenaline roared in his ears. He raised Longclaw, breath hitching in his throat. If he could land a blow now, while the Night King was contained, it might end this nightmare once and for all. The ground heaved beneath him, fracturing as a final wave of fire thundered down. The skeletal dragons shrieked in unearthly harmony, and the living dragons roared, their flames merging into a lethal crescendo. Jon's eyes burned in the white-hot brilliance, yet he pressed on, clinging to the knowledge that only through this hellish path could he reach his foe. He found himself within yards of the Night King now, close enough to feel the waves of scorching heat and the penetrating cold all at once. The figure's armor was cracked, lines of molten silver weaving through the ice. The Night King's eyes flared blue, pupils flickering like a dying star. Frost and steam burst from his mouth in hissing jets as he struggled against the conflagration. Jon raised his sword, letting out a ragged battle cry, and swung at the Night King's back. For an instant, it seemed the blow would land. Then, impossibly, the Night King turned, as if time itself bent to his will. He raised an arm just enough to intercept Longclaw with a gauntlet of pure blazing ice. The collision jarred Jon to his core. Sparks and shards scattered in all directions, and he felt Longclaw's blade bite into the Night King's armor, only to skid off, leaving a deep fissure but not delivering the killing stroke. The Night King hissed, a sound like glaciers grinding. He forced himself half around, ignoring the raging fire that battered him, ignoring the cracks in his form, and locked eyes with Jon. One pale hand clutched Jon's wrist in a grip so cold it burned. Jon gasped, muscles spasming, as an arc of icy power raced up his arm. He felt his breath freeze in his throat, the edges of his vision swimming with black spots. Above them, Drogon struggled to maintain the intensity of the combined flames. The other dragons began to tire, their spectral power waning as battered bones and sinews of magic threatened to collapse. Yet Daenerys refused to relent. She screamed, urging Drogon to unleash everything, to pour out the last vestiges of their strength. The resulting firestorm crackled with maddening force, swirling into a vortex that threatened to devour them all. Stones melted. The ground glowed a dull, molten red. Several whites disintegrated where they stood, even far from the center of the blast. Jon felt his knees buckling under the Night King's brutal clutch. The extreme cold threatened to shatter his bones from the inside, and the swirling fires around them threatened to set him aflame. The Night King pressed closer, his face inches from Jon's, a hateful intelligence burning in those frozen eyes. In that moment, Jon realized that the Night King was weakening, cracks riddling his form. But if Jon succumbed first, it would be for nothing. His mind whirled, searching for any last shred of advantage. He recalled the dragonglass dagger strapped at his hip. With a final burst of will, he tore his left arm free and drove the dagger forward into the fissure in the Night King's armor. He aimed for the faint glow that pulsed there, hoping it was some dark approximation of a heart. The blade pierced the icy flesh. A scream, an actual scream, tore from the Night King, resonating with a fury that knocked Jon backward. The cold grip on his wrist vanished. Jon sprawled across the melted, slushy ground, gasping for air as heat battered him from all sides. The swirl of flames overhead intensified, clashing with one last, desperate wave of cold that radiated from the Night King's body. Daenerys saw the silhouette of the Night King stagger. His features contorted, cracks racing across his chest and shoulders, spiderwebbing into countless pieces. His eyes flared, then flickered. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, he shattered from the inside out, exploding into a maelstrom of frost and broken ice, leaving only a storm of glittering shards spinning in the superheated air. The spear he had begun to conjure fell away, dissolving into steam. For a heartbeat, the entire battlefield seemed to freeze, every White Walker and living soul turning to stare as the epicenter of the horror broke apart in shards of cold flame. Then, in a wave that spread outward like a rolling thunderclap, the Whites collapsed. Ranks of the dead crumpled where they stood, bones clattering, flesh unraveling into dust. The White Walkers that remained shattered like brittle glass, expressions caught in silent shock. Everywhere, the once unstoppable army of the dead crumbled into lifeless fragments, leaving the battered defenders in stunned silence. A final wind swept across the courtyard, scattering snow and ash into ghostly patterns. The long night's chosen champion was undone. Daenerys, breathing in ragged gulps of scorched air, guided Drogon to land near Jon Targaryen. Her heart hammered at the sight of him lying motionless, steam curling off his black leathers. She slid from Drogon's flank, stumbling across cracked, half-molten ground. "Jon!" she cried, reaching him, dropping to her knees at his side. He coughed weakly, eyes fluttering open. The skin of his wrist where the Night King had grabbed him was blistered with frostburn, a patch of raw and angry flesh. But he was alive. He met her gaze, relief flooding them both. A tension snapped inside Daenerys, making her tremble. She pressed a trembling hand to his face, feeling his ragged breath. The roars of dragons overhead subsided to low rumbles as the skeletal guardians hovered uncertainly. Their empty eyes flicked from the place where the Night King had stood to the living Targaryens before them. The unnatural glow in their bones flickered, as if the magic holding them had been tied to the Night King's existence in ways none could have foreseen. One by one, they alighted on the ground or collapsed mid-air, their skeletal frames dissolving into a fine white dust that drifted like snow. For a moment, Daenerys thought to grieve their passing, but it felt right. Their purpose had been served. They were a memory of old Targaryen might, given fleeting form to redress a cosmic imbalance. Now that the threat was ended, they could finally find rest. Across the courtyard, men and women of every banner stood dazed among the scattering remains of the undead. They stared at one another in confusion, in astonishment, in slow-building elation. Some raised their weapons skyward in shouts of victory, or wept in disbelief. Others collapsed on the spot, finally succumbing to wounds or exhaustion. Grey Worm fell to one knee, letting his spear slip from his grasp, breath rattling in his chest. Brienne and Jaime slumped against the battlements, panting, bloodied, but alive. Sansa, from within the keep's threshold, saw the sudden stillness of the whites that had hammered at the doors. Her eyes widened as they disintegrated, leaving only a pile of ragged clothes and bones. Tears streaked her face, and she sagged against the wall, whispering a broken prayer. Jon, still reeling, let Daenerys support him as he tried to stand. He clenched his wounded wrist, struggling not to cry out. Pain flared white-hot, but relief overwhelmed it. "Is it over?" he rasped, glancing around. He saw the whites collapsed, the courtyard free from their relentless assault. A hush had fallen over Winterfell, broken only by the wheezing moans of the injured and the crackle of fading fires. Daenerys nodded, though her features were etched with exhaustion and disbelief. "It seems so," she whispered. She looked into Jon's eyes, and the enormity of what they had accomplished settled over her like a tidal wave. The army of the dead was undone, the Night King defeated. But the cost? She glanced across the courtyard and saw the mountains of bodies, the wreckage, the swirling ash and melted stone. So many had died for this victory. And winter still lingered, a biting cold that refused to lift in the pre-dawn gloom. Drogon rumbled, lowering his great head to nuzzle Daenerys' side. The warmth of his breath was both comforting and tinged with sadness. Rhaegal, far behind them, collapsed to the ground, too spent and wounded to remain standing. Jon felt a surge of dread, but Rhaegal still breathed, albeit shallowly. Ghost limped forward, pressing against Jon with a whine. Somewhere overhead, the last of the skeletal dragons dissolved into drifting motes of pale light, leaving no trace but scattered bits of bone. The courtyard was a silent memorial to the union of old magic and new determination. Davos found them, hobbling on an injured leg, his face ashen but full of incredulous joy. Behind him, Tyrion approached with wide eyes, taking in the sight of the vanished whites and the small crater of melted stone at the center of the courtyard. He looked from Jon to Daenerys, then to the spot where the Night King had made his final stand. "You did it," he breathed, voice shaking. "7 hells, you actually did it." Daenerys closed her eyes, tears slipping free, cutting warm trails through the grime on her cheeks. Jon gazed at her, finding her hand. "Not just us," he said softly. "Everyone." Night still covered them, but with the defeat of the Night King, the air felt marginally softer, the edges of the wind less cruel. Snow continued to fall, but it lacked the malignant bite that had been present before. Across the rubble-strewn yard, survivors huddled together, forming clusters of the wounded and the weary. They lit fresh torches, began searching for people trapped under debris, dragged corpses into respectful rows where possible. A sense of disbelief lingered in every corner, a fragile hope that the moment was real and not another cruel trick of the darkness. Somewhere in the battered corridors of the keep, a disoriented White Walker collapsed into fragments, the last of its will undone. Arya Stark emerged from behind it, panting heavily, eyes full of grim triumph. She glanced around, noting the sudden stillness of the dead that had besieged the hall. Slowly, warily, she moved forward, blade raised, prodding the remains. When they did not stir, she exhaled a long-held breath. Then she hurried toward the courtyard, guided by distant voices and flickering torches. Outside, she found Sansa, who ran to her, hugging her tightly. Neither sister spoke, for words could not encompass the swirl of grief and relief that threatened to break them. In the background, Gendry limped out of a partially collapsed tower, scanning the carnage before his eyes settled on Arya Stark. The tension in his shoulders eased when he saw her standing upright, alive. Bran Stark was wheeled into the open by Podrick, who had somehow survived the chaos in the Godswood. Tyrion joined them, gazing at Bran with both gratitude and curiosity. Bran's face was pale, but there was a faint glimmer of peace in his distant eyes. If he felt any personal satisfaction at the downfall of the Night King, he did not show it. Instead, he seemed to stare at something beyond the wreckage, as though his vision stretched beyond this victory into futures still unwritten. Dawn's first glimmer teased the eastern sky, a faint line of gray beyond the swirl of clouds. Whether it would truly dawn, or be just another overcast day, no one could say. But the blackness of the night did not seem so absolute now. Daenerys and Jon slowly made their way toward the steps leading to the main keep, Drogon following close behind. Their limbs ached, and their hearts were heavy with the memory of what had happened here. Yet they walked with the knowledge that they had faced the greatest threat the living had ever known, and endured. No one cheered, not yet. The price in blood and ruin was too high. But there was a sense that, in time, they might gather around hearths, share stories of the impossible night when dragons both living and undead took flight together. They might speak of the Targaryen queen whose unwavering will united ancient magic to stave off eternal winter. They would remember the Starks, Lannisters, Tarths, Mormonts, Seaworths, and so many others who had fought side by side for one crucial cause. For now, exhaustion prevailed, and the living clung to one another under a bruised sky. Daenerys rested a trembling hand on Jon's shoulder, their eyes meeting under the faint glow of a single torch. They had survived. The future sprawled before them in an uncharted wilderness of possibilities. The realm would need rebuilding. The alliances forged in the face of death might dissolve without the common enemy. Hard choices lay ahead. But for this one moment, they could breathe. The wind sang with a new note. No longer the shrieking dirge of the undead, but the quiet lament of winter shifting into something else. A harsh season still lay ahead, but not the endless night that had threatened to engulf them all. Then, through the broken gates, the first glow of a tentative sunrise reached the battered stones of Winterfell. The soft, pale light painted the courtyard's ruins, revealing the devastation in stark relief. Bodies of men and women, noble and small folk alike, lay interspersed with piles of ash and frozen remains. Yet that same light touched the living, illuminating their soot-streaked faces, giving them warmth in the cold dawn. It was a moment of silent communion with the promise that they had not fought in vain. Jon closed his eyes, remembering every face he had seen perish, every friend he might never see again. When he opened them, he looked to Daenerys, who seemed lost in similar thoughts, tears glistening in her eyes. He squeezed her hand gently, 1,000 unsaid words passing between them. They had not asked for this war, but they had borne it, and now a new day was at hand. Whether that day would bring them closer or tear them apart was unknown. All that mattered was they had held back the tide of oblivion together. A faint tremor ran through the charred stones beneath their feet, an aftershock of the cataclysmic magic that had just been unleashed. The last wisps of steam curled in the morning air. Daenerys breathed in the scent of smoke and cold, forcing herself to accept the moment for what it was, a fragile victory, but a victory nonetheless. She glanced back to where Drogon stood, licking a wound in his side. Then her gaze swept over the broken courtyard, the men and women picking through rubble, searching for survivors. She felt the weight of their gazes in return, saw the hope and the dread in their eyes. And she vowed, silently, that she would not abandon them. The living must go on. From the broken battlements above, Brienne helped Jaime to his feet, and together they looked down at the courtyard with somber pride. Tyrion stood near Bran's wheelchair, crossing his arms over his chest as he tried to frame in his mind the words he would use to chronicle this night. Davos stumbled among the wounded, offering what comfort he could, his kind eyes filled with sorrow for the fallen. Sansa and Arya embraced outside the keep's entrance, letting the small warmth of sisterhood ground them in an uncertain dawn. Gendry approached, relief scrawled on his face as he realized both sisters were alive, and he silently took Arya's hand. In the sky, the final tatters of the night's storm drifted away, revealing a pale sun that peeked over the horizon. Light glimmered off broken shards of ice and half-melted snow, off battered steel and shattered shields. Slowly, gingerly, the survivors took measure of each other. Some half expected the dead to rise again. So deep was the trauma of the night. But the corpses remained still, and the hush over Winterfell's courtyard was broken only by the moans of the wounded and the quiet murmurs of the living. Jon and Daenerys stood side by side, leaning on each other for support. Their breath puffed white in the nascent morning, their bodies trembling from injury and fatigue. Still, there was a current of strength between them, forged in the flames that had sealed their victory. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, letting the reality of it settle into his bones. The Night King was gone, his army undone. The ancient dragons that had risen to defend the living had vanished back into dust, returning to whatever grave they had come from. Life and death had collided in a cataclysm, and the living still stood. A broken hush settled, a moment of grace in the midst of devastation. Footsteps approached. Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, bloodied survivors from the north and the south, the Free Folk and the Dothraki. Each face told a story of courage, fear, and sacrifice. Jon cleared his throat, his voice rough as he spoke. "We've won," he said, though the words felt too simple. No one cheered, but their eyes shone with a quiet, stunned relief. "We've won," he repeated, as if to make himself believe it. Daenerys lifted her gaze to the horizon, heart heavy with the price paid. "We must remember them," she said softly, thinking of Jorah, of all the nameless fallen, of the dragons that would never fly again. The memory of Viserion, twisted into undead servitude, sparked a fresh ache in her chest. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. "We must remember." One by one, those gathered bowed their heads, a silent tribute to the countless who had fought and perished. They stood amid the wreckage, battered but not broken, forging an unspoken bond that transcended old grudges and alliances. This victory belonged to them all, a testament to the living spirit that refused to kneel to darkness. Ghost let out a tired whine, nosing Jon's leg. Jon managed a faint smile, stroking the direwolf's fur in thanks. The creature's warmth was a reminder that despite all of the horror, simple comforts still existed. Grey Worm gazed around, searching for unsullied survivors. Tyrion placed a hand on Davos' shoulder, not quite sure how to voice the relief they both felt. Even Podrick, bloodied and limping, stood tall beside Bran's chair, silently acknowledging the miracle that had saved them. Far overhead, searing clouds parted in the early light, and a new wind swept across the field. It carried the promise of change. Where once the howling of the dead had filled every corner, there was now space for breath and thought. There would be mourning, and rebuilding, and countless nightmares in the nights ahead. But for this single moment, the living had wrestled a future back from the jaws of extinction. Jon tightened his hold on Daenerys' arm, and she leaned into him, both of them standing as equals in the face of what remained. They had battled together, shared triumph and loss, and faced down an enemy who threatened to eradicate all they loved. That bond would shape whatever came next. The weight of crowns and thrones might matter again soon, but not yet. Not while the echoes of the undead still lingered in the corners of Winterfell's broken walls. Dawn continued to break, each sliver of light creeping steadily into the courtyard, illuminating the scorched earth and the exhausted victors. Slowly, carefully, they began to move, helping the injured, gathering the slain, extinguishing fires that still smoldered in broken towers. The day would be spent in grim tasks: burials, healing, ensuring no corner of Winterfell still harbored some undead abomination. Yet each step was made easier by the knowledge that the nightmare that had loomed over their world was gone. For now, they did not worry about the battles still brewing to the south, the claims and counterclaims, or the uncertain loyalties of those who had yet to join the cause. The blackness of the long night had retreated, and they savored the sweetness of life pulsing in their veins. Perhaps the world would never be free of war and strife, but they had proven that unity could avert even the most unimaginable doom. That memory, that victory, would endure longer than the gloom of any winter. Daenerys looked upon her people, Northmen and Unsullied, Dothraki and lords from the southern houses. She felt her heart expand with fierce pride. Many had died, but so many still lived, living proof of what could happen when men and women cast aside their differences to face a greater threat. She knew that lessons learned in blood often died fastest, but she swore in her heart that, under her rule, they would not forget. Jon drew in a shaky breath, gazing toward the battered stretch of land where thousands of the dead had once stood. Smoke and steam rose in lazy pillars. The snow trampled into muddy slush, littered with bones. "Winterfell still stands," he said softly, almost in awe. He recalled the first time he had come here as a boy, the sense of belonging he had felt, even though he was but a snow. Now, after standing against the tide of death itself, this place felt more like home than ever before. He felt Daenerys' hand slip into his, her fingers threading through his in a gesture of solidarity. Their eyes met, and though the future was full of uncertainty, they shared a profound sense of relief and a bond forged in dragonfire. Together, they faced the courtyard, full of survivors, the rising sun brightening behind them. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a fragile warmth touched Jon's face. He squeezed Daenerys' hand, drawing on that shared warmth. They had survived the darkest hour. A new day lay ahead, and though it would be fraught with challenges, it would be theirs to shape. Beneath that nascent sunlight, Winterfell stood as more than just a castle. It was a testament to the resilience of the living, a beacon in the memory of a night that had threatened to consume the world. The smoke drifted upward into a sky steadily losing its stormy shroud. Dragons, men, women, direwolves, all took what solace they could in the moment's calm. And in the hearts of many, a single thought bloomed, that even in the longest night, there was always a spark waiting to be ignited. The Targaryen dragons, both living and risen from the grave, had proven it was possible to withstand the darkest cold. In that truth, they found hope, and the first gentle stirrings of a dawn that would belong to all. Danin Town, Elwoodin. The first light of true morning spilled across Winterfell's shattered walls, a pale radiance that seemed almost fragile after the horrors of the long night. Flakes of snow still drifted down, but they lacked the furious energy of the battle storm. Instead, they fell softly, as though in mourning, settling on the courtyard's broken stones and the bodies lying in silent rows. For a time, no one moved except those performing the grim task of dragging corpses away from the rubble, or searching for signs of life among the wounded. A hush had settled, interrupted only by the crackle of dwindling fires and the raw moans of the injured. Jon Snow stood at the base of what had once been the outer rampart, leaning heavily on a broken spear to steady himself. He'd refused anyone's help to reach this vantage point, driven by a need to see the dawn with his own eyes, to convince himself that the Night King was truly vanquished. Each breath stung, dragging frigid air across the burns on his wrist and side. His face was smudged with soot, his hair stiff with dried blood. But none of the pain mattered as much as the sight of that golden line in the east, a timid dawn claiming the heavens inch by inch. He closed his eyes, letting the realization sink in. They had done it. The dead no longer held dominion. He heard the crunch of footsteps behind him and turned slightly, wincing at the ache that flared across his ribs. Davos approached, limping with every step. His usually warm brown eyes were grim. He carried a linen-wrapped bundle of dragon glass-tipped spears in one hand, but it was more a reflex than a practical choice now that the whites had fallen. The older man came to stand beside Jon, taking in the silent view of Winterfell's yard. For a moment, neither man spoke. Eventually Davos exhaled, pressing a hand to his side. "We'll need fires," he said quietly. "For the dead. We can't leave them like this." Jon swallowed, his throat tight. The aftermath of war was always ugly, but never had they faced a foe whose very existence had threatened all. The bodies lying in rows were their own. Good men, women, northerners, unsullied, Dothraki, knights, and wildlings, all jumbled together in death. Mixed in were piles of bone and petrified flesh that had once been whites. Most had crumbled into dust the moment the Night King perished, but here and there, an armor-twisted torso remained. Jon nodded at Davos's words, his voice a hoarse murmur. "We'll build pyres as soon as we're able. Make sure they have peace." Davos set down the bundle of spears with a weary sigh. "I'll see it done, but we'll need a safe place for the wounded as well. The great halls half collapsed. The gates are torn." His voice drifted off as his gaze flicked across the battered castle. Though Winterfell had survived countless winters and wars, it bore savage wounds this day. A tower had toppled into the courtyard. Gates and battlements lay in heaps. Smoke curled up from the remains of the stables. Still, it stood. Jon raked a hand through his hair. "I'll speak with the maesters. We'll set them to treat the wounded. If there are any supplies left in the stores, we'll need them all." He paused, forcing himself to meet Davos' eyes. "Thank you," he added, though the words felt paltry. "Without you, without everyone, I can't imagine." Davos silenced him with a small shake of his head. "No need, lad. There's not a soul here who won't carry scars from this day." He looked away, voice softening. "But we'll carry on because that's what the living do." With that, the Onion Knight gathered his burdens and turned, leaving Jon alone once more. Jon forced his stiff legs to climb higher on the crumbled stone pile. Each step sent pain lancing through bruised muscles. Eventually, he reached a vantage point where he could see the approach to the main gate. Broken spikes jutted from the ground, warped from dragonfire and the White's assault. Strewn across the plain outside Winterfell were the remains of the army of the dead. Most had disintegrated, leaving behind an unearthly dust. The faint winter wind carried it across the snow in ghost-like swirls. Jon's eyes moved over it, recalling the endless hordes that had marched against the castle just hours before. Gone in a single night, their threat extinguished with the fall of the Night King. It felt impossible. Yet there he stood, breathing. A rustling sound behind him made him turn in alarm. But he relaxed when he saw Arya picking her way among the rubble. She wore a coating of blood and soot, her face streaked with dirt. In one hand, she gripped a short dragon-glass dagger, though the threat was long past. Jon felt a surge of relief. He had seen her fighting in the thick of it, spinning past whites with lethal precision, but had lost track of her in the chaos. Knowing she was alive soothed an ache that had gnawed at him ever since the whites had broken through the walls. They met each other's gaze silently. Words were unnecessary. He reached out, and she clasped his forearm in a greeting that felt more heartfelt than any embrace. Her eyes, once bright with a child's curiosity, now seemed tempered by cold steel. Yet beneath that hardness, he sensed the relief that mirrored his own. After a moment, she let out a shaky breath. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice strained from hours of fighting and shouting. Jon nodded. "As far as we can tell. Bran says the White Walkers are all gone. The Whites collapsed when the Night King died. We've seen no sign of them since." Arya's jaw tightened. She lowered her gaze, and for a fleeting second, Jon saw the child she'd once been before she learned Death's name. Gently, he placed a hand on her shoulder. She stood tensely, as if bracing for some new threat, then allowed herself a brief moment of vulnerability. "We lost too many," she murmured. He didn't contradict her. Outside the walls, the drifted snow concealed countless bodies that would never return to their homes or families. "Too many," he agreed softly. "But you're here. Sansa's here. We saved each other." He paused, then added, "We'll rebuild." Arya nodded, pulling away from his grip. Her eyes flicked upward, scanning the brightening sky. "Where's Daenerys?" "I heard Drogon after the battle ended, but I haven't seen him since. And I thought I saw other dragons." At that, Jon's heart twisted. The memory of the skeletal dragons flickered in his mind, those impossible apparitions rising from the crypts. He recalled the sense of raw power that had filled the air when they combined their strange fire with Drogon and Rhaegal. He still felt uncertain how it had happened or why. But whatever force had summoned them was gone, and their remains had drifted away like ash on the wind. He lowered his gaze. "They're gone," he said, choosing not to dwell on details he himself barely understood. "Daenerys is near the Great Hall, I believe, or what's left of it. She's seen to Rhaegal's wounds." Arya nodded and turned to go, but Jon caught her arm. "Will you check on Sansa? She was helping with the wounded near the Maester's tower." Arya squeezed his hand in response, then slipped away like a shadow. Alone again, Jon gazed out over the battlefield until the ache in his bones demanded rest. At length, he turned toward the keep, picking his way down broken stairs and heaps of rubble. With each step, he felt the weight of grief and relief mingling in his blood, and he reminded himself to keep breathing, keep moving, keep living. The night had claimed so many, but it had not claimed him. He reached the courtyard to find that men were already stacking timbers, preparing great pyres for the fallen. A hush cloaked their labor, as if even the sound of hammering would disturb the memories of the dead. Tormund Giantsbane directed a few wildlings in dragging logs into place, his red hair matted against his scalp. Despite his usual boisterous spirit, Tormund's face was drawn, his lips set in a tight line. He glanced up as Jon passed, offering a grim nod. No words were exchanged. They both understood that, without Tormund and the Free Folk, the Whites might have overwhelmed Winterfell in the first hour of battle. They'd stood together, and that bond was stronger than any vow. On the opposite side of the yard, Daenerys knelt beside Rhaegal's flank, murmuring soothing words to the injured dragon. She wore heavy furs stained with soot. Her once immaculate braids tousled and undone. Her face was streaked with tears and sweat, but there was a fierceness in her eyes that said she would not collapse, not yet. Grey Worm stood nearby, his arm in a makeshift sling. He seemed to be guarding both Daenerys and Rhaegal, though the threat was gone. The Unsullied who remained formed a sparse ring around them, every posture exhausted but disciplined. Jon limped toward her, each step aggravating the burns beneath his clothes. Drogon was curled in the open space behind her, tail wrapped around himself like a cat. The black dragon's sides heaved, and plumes of smoke curled from his nostrils. His left wing bore a jagged tear where the Night King's spear had grazed him. He turned his massive head as Jon approached, rumbling in a low pitch. Whether it was a greeting or a warning, Jon wasn't entirely sure, but Daenerys rose, pressing a hand to Drogon's side to calm him. When she saw Jon, her eyes brimmed with emotions too tangled to name. Relief, sorrow, anger, and a raw sort of gratitude flickered in her gaze. She closed the distance between them, ignoring the stares of the Unsullied. For a moment, neither spoke. She simply touched his cheek gently, her fingers warm against his ice-cold skin. He looked into her face, wanting to say something that would pull them out of the numbness. But the words eluded him. "They're building pyres," he managed at last, voice hushed. "For our people, for the North, and for your people too." Daenerys blinked. "Yes. We must burn the bodies before disease sets in." "And?" She trailed off, her gaze flicking to the nearest row of fallen Unsullied, their spears still clutched in lifeless hands. "It's what they would have wanted. Many who followed me believed the flames were cleansing." She squared her shoulders. "We'll honor them, all of them, in fire." Jon gently took her hand. He felt how cold her skin was, despite the nearby dragons. "We couldn't have done it without you," he said. He glanced at the silent ring of Unsullied. "Without all of you." Her jaw tightened. She glanced at Rhaegal, who lay curled in painful stillness, and heaved a trembling sigh. "So many died, Jon. My people from Essos, the Dothraki who followed me across the sea, the allies we found in Westeros. I once believed the Iron Throne was my destiny, Now after this, I only know that we stand on the brink of a new world, and it's built upon unimaginable loss." Jon's heart clenched. He thought of what could have been had the Night King triumphed. How no kingdom would remain to squabble over. "We still need a ruler," he said softly. "A realm can't rebuild itself. You've proven your worth. People followed you across an ocean and into battle against the dead. That must mean something." He winced as a sharp twinge lanced through his arm, forcing him to shift his stance. "But we can talk of thrones and crowns later. For now we must care for the living." Daenerys nodded, exhaustion clear in every line of her posture. "Yes," she murmured. Her eyes flicked to Grey Worm, who was conferring with a pair of Unsullied carrying a wounded comrade. "We'll start by getting the wounded into the Maester's tower. The pyres can be built in the courtyard. The dragons will light them when the time comes. We'll do it at sunset, I think." She paused, rubbing the back of her neck. A final gesture to mark the end of the long night. Jon agreed, drawing her into a brief, desperate embrace. He felt her lean against him as though in that single moment she let her burden slip. His own heart ached with longing for simpler times, times that never truly existed. Then she pulled away, returning to Rhaegal. Softly, she stroked the dragon's muzzle, murmuring a lullaby in High Valyrian that Jon couldn't fully understand. He recognized the tone of it though, a soothing cadence that made Rhaegal's pupils dilate and his trembling subside. If only slightly. Jon turned toward the keep, his body protesting every step. The corridor leading to the Maester's tower was choked with debris. Broken shields, shattered timbers, and collapsed stone blocked half the passage. The stench of death lingered, though men had begun to clear bodies. He carefully picked his way around a fallen beam, guiding a half-dazed soldier who had a gash across his forehead. "Easy," Jon said quietly, supporting the man's weight until a pair of Northmen came to carry him to a makeshift infirmary. He paused when he glimpsed Sansa just inside the tower doorway. She was directing a few knights from the Vale who had survived the night, instructing them to move the wounded onto pallets of straw. Her auburn hair was disheveled, her face ashen, but she held herself with the quiet resolve of a commander who refused to crumble. When she saw Jon, relief tempered with grief flickered over her features. "Jon," she said, voice trembling slightly. "I was worried you might have been. I hadn't seen you since." He managed a faint smile. "I'm still here. Barely." The attempt at humor fell flat, so he gave her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. "You did well, Sansa. I saw you leading the villagers, keeping them safe. How many made it down to the crypts?" She closed her eyes for a second, recalling the images burned into her memory. "Many, but not all. Some died when the whites broke through part of the crypt entrance. They rose from the deeper tombs, Jon. The old dead. You warned us, but we never truly believed it could happen." She swallowed, tears threatening to escape. "We lost them. We lost so many. But even then, some of the old Stark bodies crumbled to dust rather than fight us. I don't understand it." Jon didn't pretend to. He had no explanation for the intricacies of the magic that had swirled beneath Winterfell's stones, or how some ancient dead had resisted the Night King's call, while others had been forced to rise. But he reached out, cupping her elbow, guiding her into a small alcove away from the worst of the bustle. "The survivors need you now," he said softly. "You have a gift for calming fears. You can help them rebuild." Sansa studied his face, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm no queen," she whispered, "but I'll do what I must for Winterfell and for the North." Her voice steadied. "We'll get through this." He nodded, stepping back so she could compose herself. An older maester with trembling hands approached, beckoning for her guidance, and Sansa returned to the wounded, giving quiet instructions. Jon admired her poise. She had grown so much since the days of her girlhood dreams. Together, they were all forging a new reality from the wreckage. A small cough brought Jon's attention to Tyrion Lannister, who had come up behind him. The dwarf looked exhausted, his fine clothes torn and caked with soot. His mismatched eyes took in the scene of the makeshift hospital, flickering with sadness. "It never gets easier, does it?" he asked quietly. "War, I mean, even when it's unavoidable." Jon shook his head, too spent for a proper reply. He walked with Tyrion toward an area where cots had been arranged from the remains of collapsed tables. Podrick Payne hovered near the back, his arm in a sling, offering water to an unconscious soldier. Brienne of Tarth stood over them, her face streaked with blood not her own. When she saw Tyrion, a flicker of relief crossed her stern features. She had evidently survived the night with only minor wounds, though her battered armor told the story of many close calls. Tyrion let out a weary sigh as he regarded her, then turned back to Jon. "I suppose we should be grateful we're all in one piece." Jon gave a curt nod. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride," Tyrion said ruefully, then grimaced. "And my hip, possibly, but I'll manage. I spent most of the night trying not to be crushed by falling debris while praying to gods I never believed in." Jon allowed himself a mirthless smile. "Your prayers seem to have worked." Tyrion shrugged. "Or maybe the gods were as terrified as we were." He glanced toward the window, where the faint sunlight cascaded over the broken courtyard. "How do we begin picking up the pieces, Jon Snow? The realm is in tatters. Who knows what chaos reigns in the south? And your queen, she has her own goals, does she not?" Jon thought about Daenerys' words, about how the Iron Throne, once her singular obsession, now seemed overshadowed by loss. "We'll figure it out," he said, echoing the same resolve had mustered all his life. "For now, we set aside politics and titles. We bury our dead. We nurse our wounded. When the realm sees that we fought for them, maybe we can find a measure of unity, or at least peace." "Nansend." Tyrion studied him. "I hope you're right," he said, quieter than before. "I'd like to believe there's a chance for something better than what we had." They parted then, Tyrion going to assist Davos with the pyres, and Jon heading deeper into the tower. He located a small chamber that had been turned into a resting spot for those not critically wounded. There, he found Samwell Tarly, thick glasses askew, trying to bandage someone's arm with shaking hands. Gilly hovered nearby, whispering reassurances to a pale-faced young woman who clutched a child to her chest. When Sam looked up, he let out a gasp of relief. "Jon," he exclaimed, dropping the bandage roll in his haste to stand. "You're alive." Jon's throat constricted at the sight of his friend, battered but still breathing, eyes wide with compassion, even in the midst of chaos. "I am," he replied, stepping around several sleeping bodies to clasp Sam's hand. "You?" Sam exhaled shakily. "No major wounds, but I thought I was done for so many times. I can't believe we survived." He glanced around at the wounded. "We still have to do what we can for these people. Maester Walken is overwhelmed. I'm doing my best to remember everything I learned at the Citadel, but there are so many injuries, Jon, and so few herbs left. We don't have enough of anything." Jon's mind churned, trying to think of solutions. "Is the glass garden intact?" he asked. "Maybe there are herbs we can salvage there." The glass garden was a long enclosed greenhouse to the south side of Winterfell, a place where edible plants and medicinal herbs were grown even in winter. Sam nodded but looked uncertain. "I'm not sure. I haven't had time to check. If it's still standing, we might find supplies." Jon gently lowered himself onto a stool near Sam, letting out a shaky breath. The adrenaline that had kept him upright through the battle was fading, leaving behind raw exhaustion. Sam eyed him with concern. "You're burned," he observed, noticing the ragged edges of Jon's torn sleeve. "Let me have a look." Jon started to protest, but the throbbing ache flared, reminding him he wasn't immune to mortal pains. With a slight nod, he let Sam peel back the fabric. The flesh on his wrist was red and cracked in places, ringed by frostburn where the Night King had grabbed him. In some spots, blisters had begun to form. Sam winced. "I'll clean it and wrap it with what we have. You'll need something for the pain. There might be a bit of milk of the poppy left." Jon shook his head. "Save it for those who can't bear it without. I'll manage." He let Sam gently clean the wound with a strip of damp cloth. The process stung, but Jon grit his teeth and allowed it. Afterward, Sam bound the area with linen, securing it carefully. It was a small kindness amid so much suffering. Gilly approached, a sad smile on her face. "I'm glad to see you're alive," she said softly. "Truly." John squeezed her hand. "I'm glad you made it through too, and the child." She nodded, the weight of trauma evident in her eyes. "He's safe. We sheltered in the crypts until, well, everything went wrong. But Sam found us. We got out." John didn't press for details, not wanting her to relive the terror. Instead, he thanked them both and rose unsteadily. "I have to keep moving," he said, swaying a little. "There's still much to do." Sam started to protest, but John held up a hand. "I'll rest soon. I promise. For now, people are looking to us." He forced a weary smile and left, making his way along the corridor. Hours bled together in a grueling routine of triage and grief. Men and women sorted bodies into solemn rows, covering them with sheets or cloaks if they had any to spare. Others dug through partially collapsed storerooms, searching for food, bandages, anything that might help. The courtyard was a hive of muted activity, with everyone speaking in hushed tones, as if a loud voice would break the spell of survival. Through it all, a faint strain of determination bound them. They had withstood the worst night imaginable, and they weren't about to fall apart now. By midday, a heavy snowfall returned, blanketing the scorched earth and half-burned timbers in a fresh layer of white. The pyres, though partially damp, were still prepared under tarps. Davos and Tyrion organized a system to carry the bodies from the keep to the courtyard. Grey Worm oversaw the formation of an honor guard for fallen Unsullied. Tormund and the wildlings, with the help of the remaining northern soldiers, heaped the wood higher to ensure the flames would take despite the snow. John caught glimpses of Daenerys supervising as best she could, her face set in a grim mask. Now and then, she paused to speak with a grieving soldier or to help shift a collapsed beam, ignoring calls to spare herself the labor. She moved with a sort of numb ferocity, as though the physical tasks kept her from drowning in sorrow. Drogon and Rhaegal perched nearby, occasionally fanning their wings to shake off the accumulating snow. Their presence was both a reassurance and a reminder of the fearsome power that had saved them all. Passers-by shot uneasy glances at the dragons, but none voiced complaint. This night had taught them all to embrace any ally in the face of annihilation. As dusk approached, the sky turned a bruised purple, the scattered sunlight fading into a hazy glow beyond the clouds. Word spread that the pyres would be lit at sunset. People began to gather in the courtyard, forming ragged circles around the wooden mounds. Each pyre was stacked with bodies in neat rows. No matter their origin or house, the dead were given equal dignity. The largest pyre held the bodies of House Stark's fallen, and next to it, the Unsullied and Dothraki who had perished. The Vale Knights had their place, as did the remaining sellswords and volunteers from every corner of Westeros. Jon stood with Sansa, Arya, and Bran before the Stark's pyre. Ghost limped at Jon's side, head lowered, his once pristine white fur matted with blood. Behind them, men and women carried torches, waiting for a signal. Silence blanketed the castle. It was a different sort of hush than during the long night. Less fearful, more reverent. Even the winter wind seemed subdued, as though paying respects. Daenerys walked forward, flanked by Grey Worm and Tyrion. She paused before the nearest pyre, where many of her loyal followers rested in death. She lifted a hand in silent command, and Drogon lumbered over, his claws crunching on the snow. The black dragon sniffed the air, exhaling a low rumble that vibrated in everyone's chest. Daenerys brushed her palm across Drogon's scaled cheek. In a quiet voice that carried across the hush, she whispered a word in High Valyrian. Drogon's throat swelled, and a stream of flame burst forth, igniting the base of the pyre. Nearby, Rhaegal did the same for another. The flames took hold quickly, fueled by pitch and dried timber. In moments, the courtyard glowed with the flickering light of mass funeral pyres. People stepped back to avoid the searing heat, but no one fled. Instead, they stood shoulder to shoulder, expressions solemn. Snow melted in wide circles around the pyres, creating steaming puddles. The crackle and roar of fire drowned out any attempt at conversation. But none was needed. This was a communal farewell. Jon watched the flames dance, their hypnotic flicker, licking across the bodies of those had fought alongside. Some had been dear friends, others strangers, all unified in this final burn. He felt Sansa's hand slip into his. She gripped him tightly, face set in stoic grief. Arya stood on his other side, arms crossed as though warding off the numbness. Bran gazed into the fire, his expression distant. Jon thought of all the stories Bran carried, all the memories he might share of those who were lost. It gave him comfort to think those souls would not vanish into oblivion so long as someone remembered their names. Across the courtyard, Daenerys stood close to Tyrion, her posture rigid but her face etched with sadness. The firelight made her silver hair look like molten gold. She wore no crown, no mark of royalty. She was simply a woman mourning her people, determined to see them honored. Grey Worm and the Unsullied formed a silent guard, their faces impassive, though many eyes shone with tears. The Dothraki had lost much, nearly all of their people perishing when the first wave of whites descended. A few survivors remained, standing in a knot with bowed heads, tears carving paths through the grime on their cheeks. The flames soared, devouring cloth, flesh and wood alike, sending plumes of smoke into the darkening sky. Sparks rose in swirling columns, like countless fireflies drifting upward toward the stars. For a time, no one moved. They simply watched the dead pass from the mortal realm in tongues of fire. The night was cold, yet the blaze was so intense that some had to shield their faces. Jon felt sweat bead along his brow, mingling with dried blood. The heat was oppressive, but he could not step away. This was the last service he could offer those who had given their lives to protect the living. Eventually, when the flames had risen to a steady roar and the air had grown thick with smoke, Daenerys turned from the pyres. She made her way through the crowd, heading toward the broken steps that led up to the keep's entrance. Jon understood her intention and followed. Along with a cluster of lords and knights, he tasted ash on his tongue, felt it sting his eyes. At the top of the steps, Daenerys paused, turning to face the assembly. Torches and flaming braziers lit the faces of those gathered below, the living, battered and haunted, standing on the threshold of a new age. Jon stood to her left, Tyrion to her right, and behind them, the Stark siblings, Brienne, Davos, Tormund and others who had played vital roles in the battle. Daenerys drew in a deep breath, as though mustering the strength to speak. When she did, her voice was firm, though raw with emotion. "Brave men and women of Westeros," she said, her accent shaped by Essos, but sounding resolute in these ancient halls. "You have fought the darkest night anyone has ever known. You faced an enemy that needed no rest, no mercy, and you prevailed. We stand here now, alive, because of your courage." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over them. House Stark, House Mormont, House Tarth, House Lannister, House Tully, House Arryn, Unsullied Dothraki, free folk, I honor all of you. Without your unity, the army of the dead would have consumed everything. She lifted a hand toward the pyres, tears glinting in her eyes. "Tonight, we mourn our lost. Tomorrow, we begin anew. Rebuilding Winterfell will be the first step. After that, we must see what remains of the Seven Kingdoms. We must feed the living. We must bind our wounds, bury our dead, and find a way forward." "Now, Suhani." Jon noticed she did not mention the Iron Throne or her claim. Whether it was out of respect for the dead or a genuine shift in her heart, he couldn't say. His own chest tightened at the reminder that there were other battles to fight, other ghosts of conflict that might emerge now that the dead were gone. Daenerys lowered her voice, but it carried in the hush. "We are not enemies. Not anymore. Let us remember that this night, the long night, nearly ended us all. If we can put aside old grudges to face an evil like that, maybe we can remember the bonds forged here when lesser wars arrive." A heavy silence followed. Some in the crowd stared up at her with guarded expressions, uncertain whether her words would match her future actions. Others appeared moved, tears shining in their eyes. Jon felt the weight of the moment settle on him, pressing against his heart. He glanced at Sansa, who stood at a distance, lips parted in a subtle show of surprise. Arya remained unreadable, arms still folded tight. Tyrion stepped forward slightly, offering a small nod of support. No cheers rose from the crowd, no roar of adulation. They were too exhausted, too overwhelmed by grief to muster celebration. But a faint rumble of approval, or at least acceptance, passed through them. They would stand behind any banner so long as it led them out of the nightmare. Daenerys inclined her head in acknowledgement, then turned to Jon, as if inviting him to speak. But he shook his head. He had no grand speech to give, and the people had more than enough words for one night. She offered him a small, grateful smile, then stepped back, concluding the gathering. Slowly the living dispersed to resume their tasks, or to find what rest they could. The fires continued to burn, lighting the ruins with an orange glow against the violet sky. Jon lingered near the top step, watching as Sansa shepherded some of the younger survivors toward the keep for warmth. Arya vanished into the shadows, possibly heading to the ramparts to keep her own counsel. Bran sat in his wheeled chair near the entrance, gazing out at the pyres, expression serene and distant. Tyrion joined Jon, exhaling as he watched the crowd thin. "I wonder what the history books will say of this night," he mused quietly. That the Targaryen dragons rose anew from the crypts. That the living overcame an ancient evil with the help of monstrous bones breathing ghostly fire. "It sounds like a fairy tale," Jon snorted softly. "Most of them won't believe it, even if we swear it on our lives. They'll call it myth or exaggeration." His eyes traced the sky, still seeing echoes of dragons battling overhead. "But we'll know. And we'll have Bran to remind us of the truth." "No," Tyrion chuckled, a mirthless sound. "I suppose that's enough." After a beat of silence, he murmured, "The dawn after the darkest night. We should be grateful to see it." They stood side by side, the wind tugging at their cloaks, watching the embers swirl upward. The heat on Jon's face reminded him of the living dragons and their savage might. He remembered how the skeletal creatures had answered Daenerys' call, how they had turned on the army of the dead without hesitation, and how they had dissolved into dust once the Night King fell. It was a miracle none of them could fully explain. Perhaps it was the magic of the Targaryen bloodline, or the old powers swirling beneath Winterfell, or something else beyond understanding. At length, Jon turned from the flames, every muscle protesting. His wounds ached, and his soul felt burdened by the images of the slain. But he reminded himself that they had won, that the living had a future. Step by step, he made his way inside. In a small corner of the keep, he found a quiet space near a hearth, where a few leftover blankets lay in a heap. He sank onto the stone floor, resting his head against the wall, letting the warmth of the fire creep into his bones. Ghost padded over and settled beside him, resting a muzzle on Jon's thigh. Absently, Jon stroked the direwolf's fur, each breath shaking loose the tension in his chest. His eyelids drooped. For the first time in what felt like centuries, sleep teased the edges of his consciousness. Outside, the pyres burned on, a vigil against the memory of endless darkness. He listened to the distant crackling of flames, the faint sobs and whispered conversations drifting through the corridors, the hiss of wind through shattered windows. It was a lullaby of a world wounded but not destroyed. Before he succumbed to the pull of exhausted slumber, he felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. He opened his eyes to see Daenerys kneeling beside him, her expression softened by weariness. She didn't speak. She simply settled against his side, resting her head on his shoulder, as Ghost made room for her. Jon inhaled the faint scent of smoke in her hair. Let the steady rhythm of her breathing calm him. No throne or crown existed in that moment. They were just two people clinging to the solace of each other's presence. He murmured her name, and she responded by lacing her fingers through his. Neither moved. Neither needed to. The night was done. Dawn had broken. All that mattered was that they were alive to see it. Fatigue finally claimed him, drawing him into a dreamless sleep. The fortress still smoked and crumbled around them, the world still threatened by uncertain storms. But for the first time in a long, long while, hope remained. And though the memory of skeletal dragons and the howling dead would haunt them, they had proven that even the mightiest darkness could be challenged if the living stood as one. The hush that fell over Winterfell was no longer the hush of fear. but the hush of a battered realm seeking renewal, forging the first steps into whatever future they might shape beyond the flames.